two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with John Monkovic and Sabrina Leddy. Both are organizers with Ithaca DSA's relatively new FreeCAT campaign. So Sabrina Leddy, start off, what is FreeCAT?
Yeah, sure. So FreeCAT is a campaign advocating for fair, free, and expanded TCAT services in Tompkins County. It was initiated last winter by the Ithaca DSA, the Democratic Socialists, and it was kind of born from our desire to see more progressive climate action after Ithaca's Green New Deal was passed. The Green New Deal states that one of its main goals is to ensure that any resulting benefits are shared equally among local communities, so to reduce social and economic inequities. But that motion was passed in 2019, and we believe that we've seen little being done to that effect thus far. And so arguably, we think we should be focusing on what can be done for the most disadvantaged, underserved communities in this area before anyone else. So we decided that our focus for the DSA chapter efforts for our priority campaign should be to make public transit more accessible. And more than half a year later, we have an amazing group of people working hard on the FreeCAT campaign.
Sounds good. Let's see. So what other groups are we associated with in this, if any?
Yeah, so right now we have like collaborative efforts with Sunrise Ithaca and the Cornell Progressives. And we're working also with some members of Ithaca's Common Council and the Tompkins County Legislature, just to get a sense for what support we have in those communities.
Good. So could you say a little more about FreeCAT's mission, how to achieve fair, free, expanded public transit? I think, and is the idea of making it free without, with people not having to pay fares, in some sort of a conflict with the idea of expanding the service?
I can try to tackle
Go ahead,
that question.
John.
Yeah. So as Sabrina had kind of mentioned, equity and sustainability are two kind of key pillars to the campaign. And interestingly, we combine fair, free, and expansion because going fair, free would actually kind of necessitate expansion. The whole idea behind going fair, free is to encourage more people to use public transportation, which of course we want, to reduce emissions and whatnot. And because you're inviting more people to use your service, you actually need to expand to meet that demand. So that's part of the thinking of our campaign. And expansion is also important to us because we know that it's easier to get a ride on the bus on one side of town than the other. And we're not meeting all the need that there is. Here in Tompkins County, there are definitely underserved areas that are not being touched. So that's a big goal and one that will be hard to achieve, but that we also want to strongly incorporate into our campaign.
So maybe be a little more explicit. Which side of town is well served and which side isn't?
Sure. Well, we know, Cornell students in the Cornell community are really well served, and that really disproportionately served by TCAT services. Whereas, out at West Village, for example, it bus service is far less frequent. So just
Well,
as an example.
I think at West Village, it's once an hour.
Hmm.
And as someone who lives in College Town, I know that the number 30 bus comes through nowadays every 15 minutes.
Right.
Yeah. And I can expand on
Go
that
ahead.
a little bit, or I guess I would just be agreeing with you, John. I think that while climate activism was the original motivator, and it does remain a main tenet of this campaign, of course, I think our campaign believes strongly that accessible transportation and just basic mobility are human rights. And at this moment, you have people who are already in underserved communities who face even greater hardship because of the current public transit system. You have like elderly persons who no longer drive, or people with disabilities, or working class people who either can't afford a car, or due to high rents in Ithaca, they have to commute from out of the city. And so they have to buy a car because they don't have as much access to public transit. And then you have to buy gas. And it's just a huge financial burden on people who are already financially burdened. So it's cyclical and it's demoralizing. And I think it really contributes to an isolated, static population with like reduced resources in very specific communities. And I think it exacerbates social inequities. So I think it should be a main focus of Ithaca's Green New Deal to achieve something similar to FreeCAT, to go fare free and to expand their service. And I think that's why we chose expansion and fare elimination jointly as goals. I completely agree with John's point that one necessitates the other. You can't have one without the other and have it really be an act for equity. So, yeah.
And I would like to hear a little more about what expansion means, because it could be in space, it could be in time.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we haven't figured out all the details there, obviously, and we are not TCAT itself, so we're not exactly even trying to make those decisions, but we're trying to create a community demand for underserved areas to be served the right amount. And so, yeah, it'd be both geographic and frequency that we have in mind in terms of expansion.
Yeah.
So
And I think
more frequent is, I know for me, more frequent is just key to using it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's a question of frequency and probably establishing new routes or altering the current routes to make sure that they are hitting all of the areas so that it's serving everybody in the community. I think that our campaign is still in its infancy in that way, that we are hoping to engage in canvassing efforts where we can hear more directly from these communities where they need services. I think that is a resource and a body of knowledge that's really lacking because these communities don't often get a voice. And so we're hoping that working like ideally in collaboration with TCAT and their ability to like conduct polls or having polls of our own, just figuring out where service is needed, where it needs to be more frequent, and where it's completely absent, that it needs to be established. And that doesn't necessarily need to be in the form of like a full-sized bus. There have also been discussions of, smaller options for areas that there would be fewer riders, but still riders that should be serviced if it needs to be like TCAT establishing vans or something like that.
And I guess the next question that comes up is, are these FreeCAT goals attainable, achievable? Are they possible?
Yeah,
Go ahead,
they
John.
certainly are. And one other thing to kind of explain a bit of the history as well is one thing that's important to understand is that the fare box is really super expensive to maintain and to implement, and there's a ton of maintenance costs and technology implementation costs there, which would be removed under a fare-free vision. And so we currently have this kind of paradox where we're paying a lot of money to close the doors to people. And I think a big focus of our campaign is to argue that maybe we should be investing in opening the door to as many people as possible, and also making sure buses are just driving by people that aren't currently being driven by. But there are definitely models of fare-free transit as a start, fare-free and expanded transit all across the US. And one example that we've really been looking at is a really comparable city in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, a college town that hosts UNC. And we saw UNC back in the early 2000s, I believe, make a really big investment in their local transportation system, and they went fare free over 20 years ago, and since then have been gradually expanding. And so we know it will be a long process of building the kind of public transit system we want to see, but it can absolutely be done, especially when the kind of big economic powerhouse of the city, which in our case is of course Cornell, makes a strong investment in this.
Yeah, I think that is really integral to achieving our goals, is that we do want Cornell to contribute significantly more than they are, and probably make up for the loss of fare revenue in the budget. And I agree. I think Chapel Hill is a great example of this. They, like John said, they adopted in the early 2000s, and their current model right now is that the university pays for about 40% of the budget of their transit system, whereas the two local governments there, which in our case would be the county and the city, pay for about 25%, and then the rest is covered by state and federal assistance. And with UNC, with the university there having less than half of the financial resources of Cornell, but in terms of sheer dollars, they're paying more than 3 times as much for their public transit system. I don't see what's stopping Cornell from doing the same, from making the same investment, both to kind of achieve the goal of sustainability in part that they seem to advocate for, that they claim they want to support, and also to support these communities that they just truly couldn't live without. So yeah, I that's why I think our campaign would really like to push the university to just support the community more tangibly, the community in which they operate and on which they depend. And I think that it would also increase ridership significantly for TCAT, and that would probably help incentivize service expansion. I know in Chapel Hill, they saw like their rider number just per year doubled after they went fare free. So.
And how is TCAT, our bus system, currently funded?
Sure, I can tackle some of that. So about half of the current budget comes from state and federal funding. And beyond that, we have 3 financial underwriters locally. We have Cornell, the City of Ithaca, and Tompkins County. And that began when 3 different bus services actually merged to form TCAT, the system. So each underwriter contributes 6% each. And then on top of that, Cornell has something called the bulk fare agreement, which amounts to about 20%. And what the bulk fare agreement is it's a kind of per ride negotiated lump sum that Cornell pays for all of the free bus service It essentially buys for first-year students, whether that be undergrads or also graduate students, faculty, and there could be some other groups I'm forgetting there. But they pay kind of per ride almost, a negotiated down cost, and a big lump sum. And this is something that comes up a lot in our discussions with people about how we'd attain a kind of FreeCAT vision that we're looking for, because they say, well, if you're looking to eliminate fares, then all of a sudden Cornell can say, well, we want the bulk fare agreement struck down, and then we're removing, you know, almost $4 million from your budget. But what we want to see is a kind of reconceived percentage-wise investment from Cornell, like we see with UNC, where instead of kind of per ride calculating what Cornell owes the city, we want to see just a percentage investment in TCAT, full stop, in the 30 to 40% range.
Sounds interesting. Another little side trip into all of this. Some people may be thinking, how is any of this at all good for the environment? Aren't those buses big, noisy, diesel burning, exhaust spewing monsters? And I see John smiling.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things to address there. Firstly, TCAT is undergoing a transition to electric buses. They already have, I'm not sure how many, I think it's close to 10, or don't quote me on that figure.
Yeah.
But they're transitioning their bus fleet into all electric, which is great to see. But beyond that, buses are, of course, a form of public transportation, which is much preferable to private single person vehicle transit in terms of reducing emissions. So it's absolutely a step forward. And when we don't invest in, a sustainable public transit alternative, people will use the private vehicle option, which we know is worse for the environment. So there's an opportunity cost to not investing in this.
Yeah, and I would just say, in terms of like assigning some statistics to it, that currently in the Tompkins County community, private transit takes up like 30 to 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, and estimates from various transportation coalitions in the nation say that switching to public transit can reduce that by up to 45%. And I think that that's because of the number of people on the bus, that buses, even though they look like they probably are much worse than a private vehicle, because of the number of private vehicles they would take off the road from all the passengers in them, they release I think a fifth or a fourth of the amount of emissions that the number of private vehicles it would take to commute all of those people on the bus. So it's just generally much preferable to private vehicles. And I also think it provides more of a sense of community to be able to be in a space with your fellow community members, as opposed to being stuck in traffic among about 200 other private vehicles.
Yes, who wants to be stuck in traffic? And I can well imagine that the TCAT system will finish electrifying its vehicles over a number of years, but probably much sooner than the general public of car owners, where especially the lower income people will be keeping old gas guzzlers alive year after year after year. I mean, that's kind of what transportation in this county has been in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's another, that even beyond the health of our planet, you get to the health of the people who inhabit it, and the fact that the negative consequences of the climate crisis are going to be felt disproportionately by disadvantaged communities, like these low-income communities and communities of color and people who can't afford to buy a new electric car. They're going to feel the health consequences more than somebody who is able to like live in a less polluted area and somebody who's able to afford an electric car. So
Yeah.
it's just tenfold, I think, an idea to support.
Well, I think health consequences are every bit as much for the person outside of the car as for the person inside the car.
Mhm.
So who has the power to make the kinds of decisions that would actually achieve the FreeCAT goals?
Yeah, I think John explained really well through his description of the financial underwriters at TCAT that those are the groups that we are really focusing on at present. The county legislature, the Ithaca city government, specifically the Common Council, the legislative body, and then Cornell itself. And I think we don't really expect that our grassroots campaign alone will convince Cornell to contribute to the degree that we would like them to. So instead, we're focusing on gaining official support from the other financial underwriters from the local governmental bodies. First, probably by passing resolutions supporting our idea in the legislative bodies. Which we think would do a lot to incentivize Cornell. And I think there is a general hesitance here to do anything that would really upset Cornell, but we're really hoping that we can mobilize not just the elected officials, but like as a grassroots campaign to really get the people in our community and the constituents to advocate for themselves, and hopefully then that their elected officials who should be representing the constituents will advocate for them as well.
Yes, I mean, as someone who works on housing, I just dream of our parking lots being converted into housing. That's, lack of land at the center is one of the community's big problems. And the amount of land that is devoted to parking lots and also parking spaces is huge. Not that I've actually seen a statistic, but I've seen the parking lots.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that reminds me of, I guess, another point that I wanted to make clear, that I do think it's often through intentional deflection and not ignorance that Cornell has avoided things like this in the past. I think like many people circulating in this area, I know John and I are here short term for educational opportunities. And I haven't lived in Ithaca for very long, but in my research for this campaign, I learned about the destruction of the Redbud Woods for a parking lot that I'm sure many long-term residents of the county and the city are aware of, but I think would be news to many. So like just to summarize it briefly, that the Redbud Woods had stood in Ithaca for well over a century. And after decades of trying and resistance from protests, but eventually winning a court case, Cornell raised it to build a parking lot, even though Ithaca's Common Council had declared that it was a historical site a few years prior. And Cornell then, as they do now, as I said, they argue that sustainability is one of their main goals, but I find it hard to believe when they do things like that. And especially that a key point in the negotiating agreement that they signed with protesters was that they would provide free bus passes. They would make fare free a reality for their students. And then they didn't. They fell through on it. 2 years later, they eliminated it. And I think they feel probably that they can take advantage of the high turnover in their community, that people will forget about things like that. But I think that, I don't think they should be allowed to back out of agreements like that. And I really think that that idea should be expanded well beyond students, because like I said, I don't think that the university could exist without the community that it exists in. I think the statistic that I've seen is that a quarter of the residents of this county work for Cornell, or almost a quarter, somewhere between 20 and 25%. And I think that it just makes sense to me that they would pay back essentially by giving them more sustainable transit options, more accessible transit options.
It certainly would make sense. So how do you intend to put pressure on Cornell? Maybe just, I think you've said it, but recap.
I can step in. So we're looking to introduce non-binding resolutions to Common Council and also Tompkins County Legislature, just to kind of get the idea on the floor, have these local officials engaging with it, and also because ultimately these bodies are the underwriters of TCAT, and they appoint representatives to the TCAT board, which ultimately decides TCAT's future. So they absolutely do have power to make a difference and to steer TCAT into this or that direction.
Okay. And if listeners or viewers are inspired to get involved, what can they do?
Yeah, they can reach out to Ithaca DSA through any platforms, be it Twitter, Facebook, or our website. If you look up Ithaca DSA and get involved in our campaign that way, someone will put you in touch. We are looking for people to speak at various meetings over the coming weeks and months, be it TCAT board meetings or Common Council and legislature meetings. So that would be wonderful to see people come out and voice their support for this.
Well, thank you, John Monkovic. Thank you, Sabrina Leddy. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.